The following is the news that mainstream media on one side or the other hasn't provided you. Please keep an open mind. This has all been fact-checked.
Feature of daily life at this point in the nation's capital. Over the weekend, 21 people were shot in a single incident in Washington. More than half of them were women. One was a D.C. police officer. It was the single biggest mass shooting in America this year, and yet you probably heard nothing about it. Members of Congress didn't lock arms on the House floor to demand an end to the gun violence. CNN didn't book a procession of weepy teenage gun control activists or an extended town hall meeting. News organizations barely touched the story, and when they did, they moved on fast. It wouldn't help the Biden campaign to talk about it, so they didn't talk about it. As far as we can tell, neither CNN nor MSNBC even mentioned it today. 21 people shot in a group in our capital city, and they acted like it didn't happen. But it did happen. We're showing it to you on the screen right now. 21 African Americans shot by gunmen, yet the media spent all weekend telling you about how Simon Cowell fell off his electric bike in Malibu, because really, Black Lives Matter. MSNBC wants you to know that. It's grotesque. But it's now the rule. Dead bodies don't count unless they are politically useful dead bodies. Last month, gang members shot 15 people outside a funeral home in Chicago. It looked like Fallujah. We played some of the video of it on this show. It was very upsetting. The other channels did not play it. None of the primetime hosts on CNN or MSNBC even mentioned the shooting. They didn't care. Politicians didn't care either. Muriel Bowser is the mayor of Washington, D.C. Bowser claims to care about black lives very much. She ordered the slogan, Black Lives Matter, in fact, painted in yellow on the road leading to the White House, just to underscore how much she cares. So how did Muriel Bowser respond when 21 African Americans were gunned down in her city? Well, she talked about her coronavirus lockdowns. Bowser has banned gatherings in the city of more than 50 people, and apparently there were more than that at the cookout where the shooting occurred. This enraged Muriel Bowser. Here's what the mayor said about the shooting yesterday, quote, "It's important as a community that we have a zero tolerance for this kind of activity," end quote. Now, to be perfectly clear, Mayor Bowser was not talking about the mass shootings. When she said we need zero tolerance, Bowser is happy to tolerate violence. She does every day. She often encourages violence. What Bowser won't put up with is citizens violating her lockdown orders. Bowser's chief of police, a man called Peter Newsham, reiterated that point. Quote, "We can't have these large gatherings in the city," the chief said. In other words, shootings are acceptable as long as the police don't commit them. But disobey our corona decrees and we will come for you. The media wholeheartedly agree with this, of course. Violence does not bother them. They encourage it regularly. Disobedience bothers them. This weekend, motorcycle riders, mostly on Harley-Davidsons, from all over the country gathered in Sturgis, South Dakota for their annual rally, the Sturgis Rally. Some of them forgot their masks. This outraged our news media. The people on motorcycles were too masculine, too patriotic, therefore too unlikely to vote for Joe Biden to go uncriticized. So the media spent a lot of the weekend trying to shame the bikers into disappearing. In other words, as some of the poorest people in Washington bled onto the sidewalk, this is what your news anchors talked about.
A bike rally is drawing tens of thousands of people to a small town in South Dakota where doctors warn could turn into a coronavirus super spreader event.
Not seeing a lot of masks there. Very little social distancing is what we're hearing from our team on the ground.
Tell people what the odds are, tell people what the risks and the dangers are, and let them decide and expect them to be responsible.
To others, that event, a reckless affront to common sense and a likely coronavirus super spreader.
Oh, super spreaders. In other words, men who are unapologetically male. They hate that. Meanwhile, the city of Washington, back in the real world, continued to spiral toward chaos. In Georgetown, one of the richest, most liberal neighborhoods in the city, certainly in the country, a group of thugs marched down residential streets in the middle of the night to make certain that no one was sleeping. People who live there must have been confused. In Georgetown, Black Lives Matter yard signs are about as common as designer dog breeds, very common. The residents apparently thought they'd bought themselves peace by paying their indulgences with the correct political slogans, but they hadn't. The fact their neighborhood is still safe is now considered a crime, and the mob made that very clear. you see that footage on CNN? Oh, you didn't. You saw footage of super spreaders at Sturgis. How dare they ride motorcycles without masks? Meanwhile, back in Georgetown, again, the real world, just in case the residents there didn't feel sufficiently threatened, the mob then barricaded Key Bridge, the Francis Scott Key Bridge. It's the main artery from Georgetown out of the city. Blocking main arteries out of cities is an obvious threat to public safety. It's far more dangerous than any overattended cookout. But police didn't stop it. They helped the mob. And once again, the media collectively ignored all of it. And what exactly did the liberal, passive, heavily elderly residents of Georgetown do to deserve this kind of abuse and harassment from a mob of Joe Biden voters? That's the core question. But no one understands hold because it's politically inconvenient. In Los Angeles, for example, a city council member called Mike Bonin voted to slash the LAPD budget by $150 million. He's very opposed to the police. But that didn't stop him from calling the police. Since April, it turns out that cops have been called to Bonin's home 8 separate times, often to deal with, surprise, surprise, protesters. Bonin's defense is that he didn't make the calls. No, somehow the LAPD, with collusion from right-wing elements, made the calls. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't make sense. But it's good enough for the newspapers in Los Angeles. They're not covering the story. It's not a story. Right. Guy who votes to defund the police calls them 8 times to keep the lunatics from coming through his front door. Not a story. Okay. Last Thursday, meanwhile, in Portland, Oregon, a city that effectively no longer has a government, rioters threw paint on an elderly woman. What was her crime? She made the mistake of trying to stop them from destroying a building. Here's why this is so interesting. As the mob attacked her, they explained their agenda. Quote, "This isn't your world anymore," they shouted. "Put your mask on." Boy, does that tell you everything. Meanwhile, in the city, sure, they'll vote for Joe Biden, obviously, but this isn't about the election. They just want to steal things. And in effect, authorities there, as they are in so many places, are allowing them to do that. Early this morning, caravans of looters sacked stores in downtown Chicago. Here's part of it. Justification for that. There's always a story at the bottom of these things that the media repeat, allow them to believe it was justified. The pretext for that theft and destruction you just saw was a false report that a teenager had been executed by the police. It was a lie, as it turned out. It usually is a lie. In fact, a 20-year-old had been killed after shooting at the police. Whatever. We're so used to violence justified by lies that few people seem to notice the difference. And speaking of, just this weekend, Joe Biden honored Michael Brown, that was the man killed in Ferguson, Missouri, after he violently attacked a store owner on tape and then a cop. Joe Biden apparently doesn't remember that part. He seems to consider Michael Brown a martyr. It's hard to know who in America still believes these lies. Most people no longer seem to believe anything they hear from politicians. When everything is political, we learn to trust nothing. But one thing that is real and will always be real is the debris left behind. Bullet holes are real. So are burned stores. So are boarded up windows and terrified neighbors. That will always be real. And we have it. So what will be the aftermath of all of this? What are America's cities going to look like a year from now? There's no question people will flee Georgetown. They may have BLM signs in their driveways. It doesn't mean they want screaming BLM lunatics on their streets. They don't. Nobody does, actually, no matter what they tell you. No matter what color they are. No one likes that. That's true for people in Georgetown, in Portland, Oregon, in San Francisco, in Chicago, New York, any other place where order and decency have disappeared. People will not live long with chaos. No matter what they tell you, no matter what signs they put in their yard, they will leave. And many of them have already left. We're about to see one of the great demographic shifts in American history. Unless the insanity stops, and soon, our biggest cities will revert to what they were 50 years ago. Broke, dirty, and dangerous. On the bright side, we'll have resolved the gentrification problem. So a lot of college professors have patted themselves on the back.